Welcome to another episode of One Idea Away, where we're committed to living more fully, deeply, and consciously. Why? Because when we do, we're calmer, we're clearer, we're more connected, more joyful, and much more alive. On this show, we bring you stories of those that are figuring it out just like us, as well as experts who can shed light on the hows and the whys all of this stuff works. So I want to thank you all for tuning in and sharing and reviewing our show. If you haven't done so yet, please drop us a review. Also, subscribe to the podcast on our feed, whether it's on iTunes or whatever app you happen to be using. And if there's something that stands out in the show, do us a favor. If it makes you think of somebody, share it along, because this show is meant to get the conversation started, not just to drop in for a little inspiration. So with that, let's turn to this week's episode. Finally, it's finally here. And today I get to announce and tell you about Uncover, a retreat to create the life of your dreams. Uncover is a 3-day retreat being hosted by One Idea Away. I'm going to be there leading and facilitating the retreat, along with IPEC founder and best-selling author Bruce Schneider. We've secured the beautiful Asilomar Conference Grounds in California, just a 90-minute ride from the Bay Area, for January 18th through the 20th. And then we're going to be at the Garrison Institute in New York, just 50 miles north of the city, sitting atop the bluffs of the Hudson River on March 29th through the 31st. In this retreat, we're going to guide you through the Uncover process. You can actually learn more about that in the book, Uncovering the Life of Your Dreams by Bruce Schneider. And you're going to learn and experience a variety of mindfulness activities, share and connect as a community, and learn through practices and dialogue in a supportive and, yes, judgment-free zone. You see, this is about closing the gap between who you know yourself to be and how you're currently showing up in life. You see, that gap is part of the tension that any of us can feel in our hearts and minds, because you know there's something more for you to experience, to enjoy, to share, and to contribute. You may feel as if who you are is covered up by your responsibilities and circumstances and priorities, and we don't want to see anyone lose any more years of their lives not being who they fully and truly are. It's time for that to end, and over these 3 days it will. You will uncover your personal path to happiness, freedom, and aligning with your true desires. I cannot wait to meet you in person. I can't wait to spend the time with you over these 3 days. It's going to be an extraordinary experience. Just go to oneideaaway.com/retreat. That's oneideaaway.com/retreat. I promise you, you will never forget this experience. You know, I'm not sure if anyone has noticed out there, but our politics, education, society, it's getting a little bit polarized. All right, so it's possible you noticed. It's kind of hard to miss unless you've turned off all news, social media, notifications of any kind, and you just don't simply talk to anybody. But we get into a whole range of subjects on this show, and the core of what we're after are ways to help you live more fully, deeply, and consciously. And I believe the rubber meets the road on all of this when it comes to those everyday situations, which includes how we interact with each other, parenting, education, and yes, even that lovely third rail of politics too. You see, when we bring up topics like mindfulness and awareness, it's not because it's a recipe for all of us to go meditate in a cave somewhere. It's a call for us to bring this into our everyday lives, to understand what's really going on, to take a look at what do we believe and why do we believe it? How do we think and why do we think and perceive that way? What are the parts of us that are unconscious, that are conditioned, that run us in more ways than we would care to admit? And how can we make more of that unconscious conscious? Or at the very least, be aware of how our psychology and biology perform in such a way so that we know what's going on, so we can make more conscious decisions about how we interpret our life experiences and encounters in a way that build us personally and collectively. So today's going to be a fun conversation with Jonathan Haidt. I originally got turned on to his work when he wrote the book Happiness Hypothesis. In there, he actually talks about that conscious-unconscious dynamic in a powerful way that I'm going to ask him to share in a little while. His written work has since focused on some of the really interesting dynamics that have been playing out in society. John's research examines the intuitive foundations of morality and how morality varies across cultures, including here in America, the different cultures between progressives, conservatives, and libertarians. And so in his second book, The Righteous Mind, he explores the divide that's been occurring due to politics and religion. And in his latest work, which he co-authored with Greg Lukianoff. It's called The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. In this book, he looks at how those various patterns in politics and parenting, education, and justice are playing out on college campuses. So I should share that as a day job, John is a social psychologist at NYU Stern School of Business, received his PhD from UPenn in 1992, and taught for 16 years in the Department of Psychology at the University of Virginia. At NYU currently, he is applying his research on moral psychology to business ethics, asking how companies can structure and run themselves in ways that will be resistant to ethical failures. And with all of that, John, I want to thank you so much for being here on One Idea Way.
Well, thank you, Luke. I think that's about the most information that has ever been packed into an introduction for me.
Excellent. I guess maybe let's start here. Let's kind of start with a baseline. At the heart of your most recent work, the Coddling of the American Mind, what would you say is the chief idea or message that you really want people to walk away understanding?
That human growth and development is complicated. It requires challenges and even sometimes facing threats and setbacks. And in our efforts to help our children at all ages, all the way through college, we have been depriving them of the opportunities they need to grow. The result has been a generation, not the millennials, but Gen Z or iGen. The result has been a generation that's having a lot of trouble, that is much more easily threatened, much more easily discouraged, much more likely to be depressed, anxious, and ineffective.
Yeah, I think there were some of the anecdotes, let alone the research and data that you shared, were pretty actually alarming in some of the things that are going on, and we are going to get to that. There were sort of two things that I also noticed, though, across the work that was presented that I wanted to ask you a little bit about. I know that, you know, within the most recent book, you talk about some of the macro trends that are going on, 6 particular pressures that are coming from politics, education, parenting, and justice that have contributed to this. But also something I've heard you talk about, and it wasn't specifically a chapter in the book, but something I've heard you raise, is that there seems to be almost this turning away from the long view of things, that we seem to be a little bit more focused on how do we take the short-term perspective, either for alleviation of discomfort or pain, or some temporary result that we're after. And I'm just kind of curious as to, you know, whether you also would agree with that, because I can't say that was specifically presented in your work, but I'm curious if you agree with that, and what are you seeing in relation to that idea of turning sort of away from the long view?
Well, in general, when we think about our children, we think about a company, we think about anything that we're nurturing, we think it's best to take the long view, and these might be our considered thoughts. But I'm a social psychologist, and social psychologists tend to focus on social pressures, aspects of the local context that affect our behavior. And so we often act in ways that we recognize are not wise. This was one of the major themes of my first book, The Happiness Hypothesis, in which there's a wonderful quote from Medea, from I guess Virgil. He says, "I see the right way and approve it. Alas, I follow the wrong." So ancient cultures, East and West, knew that we had the separation between the part of us that can think and plan and the part of us that actually makes our decisions. The part that makes our immediate decisions tends to be very influenced by what's, like I never order dessert, but once dessert is on the table near me, like if my wife orders it, I'm almost powerless to stop my hand from picking up a fork and putting some of it into my mouth. So this is, of course, this is, if you're thinking about well-being, if you're engaged in coaching people, you want to try to help them to align their short-term behavior with their long-term desires.
And if actually, I would like, because the second thing that I noticed is the inherent awareness that does run underneath all of the work that you're presenting. Because I think you, in your first book, you presented that dynamic of the rider and the elephant, representing the conscious and unconscious. I was hoping you could share that, because I think a lot of them, the patterns and trends that we're going to talk about, are ways in which the elephant has really kind of run away with us a bit.
Yes. So I love to make up metaphors. I'll probably make up 3 new ones before our talk is over. But the one that's going to be engraved on my tombstone, because it's the one that people seem to have most resonated to, is the idea that the mind is divided in parts that sometimes conflict. Now, this is something that every culture that has left us writing has noticed. And it's often, we often get the metaphor of a rider on a horse. That's what Plato gave us in the Phaedrus, a charioteer trying to steer 2 chariots. But when I was writing The Righteous Mind, I wanted something a little different. The unconscious part, the automatic or unconscious part of our mind is bigger than a horse. That is, it's almost everything that goes on in our mind. And then the conscious reasoning part is really tiny. So I wanted something bigger than a horse. And I thought, well, how about an elephant? And then that also was great because elephants are really, really smart, much smarter than horses. And so I had the idea that to use the metaphor that the mind is divided like a rider on an elephant, where the rider is our conscious reasoning and the elephant is everything else. It's especially the automatic processes, the intuitive processes, the emotions. Now, it's quite possible that I simply stole the metaphor from Buddha, because Buddhists talk about the important, like that one should tame one's mind as a trainer tames an elephant. So I was reading all this ancient stuff. I might well have gotten it from Buddha. I'm happy to credit him. But this metaphor has really resonated, especially with therapists. Yeah. So anybody doing any kind of therapy, they often report back to me that this is the metaphor that really helped them get through to their patients and clients.
Excellent. So for everybody with those couple of thoughts and this buildup kind of in the background, just keep that in your mindset as we have the rest of this conversation as to what's going on. So one of those key terms, obviously, that jumps out as soon as you take a look at your new book is that word coddling of the American mind. So maybe we can also then start there of what specifically did you mean in choosing that word coddling?
Sure. So we didn't choose it. It was chosen for us by the editors at The Atlantic. So Greg Lukianoff and I wrote this article. Greg had this brilliant insight into what was going wrong on college campuses, that suddenly in 2014, plus or minus a year, we started seeing students asking for trigger warnings, safe spaces, microaggression training. They seemed, it was as though their skin had been rubbed raw, and they were suddenly being damaged or harmed. At least they thought they were being harmed by words, by ideas, by the presence of a speaker or a book. And Greg had this insight that the students were basically engaging in the exact same cognitive distortions that he had learned not to do when he learned how to do cognitive behavioral therapy for a suicidal depression that he had suffered in 2007. And so our idea was that students were learning to catastrophize, to do black and white thinking. Everything is either good or terrible, to discount the positives, to do emotional reasoning, to go based on their feelings. And we wrote an article called Arguing Toward Misery, as though students were somehow learning to argue in ways that were making them depressed and anxious. At the time, we were hearing a lot about a rise of mental illness, especially depression and anxiety on campus, but we couldn't get clear, hard statistics to prove it. So we wrote up the article, submitted to The Atlantic. They didn't like our boring title, and they came up with The Coddling of the American Mind. And we were a little concerned because it seems kind of insulting to the students, although a lot of the students do recognize that many in their generation are doing this. So coddling just means overprotecting. Yeah. And we're not saying students are spoiled. Students have a lot of challenges, a lot of debt. It's harder to get into college than it ever was. We're not saying students are entitled or spoiled. What we're saying is that they have been overprotected. And this, I think, is indisputable and is indisputably bad. And when we overprotect kids, we prevent them from developing the ability to live independently. This is what we've done to kids born after 1995.
So one of the absolute, to pull one of those stats that you quote on to give just a horrendously alarming statistic about the way in which we are coping and moving through and meeting the challenges of what's coming up. You share a statistic that since the early part of this decade, around 2010 or 2011, the suicide rate for boys is up 25%, but for girls it's up 70%.
That's right.
In 7 or 8 years. That's right. Insane.
It's insane. It's absolutely stunning. So the suicide rate for girls has been fairly stable from 1980, when we looked at a variety of federal databases on mental health and suicide, the CDC rates of fatal injury, and the girls' rate is fairly stable. And then it just begins rising around 2011, 2012. And if you take the average of the first 10 years of the century, and then to get a stable number, because it fluctuates a bit, and then you look at where it's been for the last 2 years in a row, for girls, it's up 70%. It's absolutely stunning. And this totally conforms with the self-reports. There are several surveys that have shown that teenage boys and girls before college and in college, so this is not just about college. This is something is going wrong with Gen Z or iGen. So on several surveys, they report much higher rates of depression, anxiety. They conceive of themselves as being much more fragile, much more mentally ill. Now, most are doing fine. This is not about the majority. Right. But when you go from a couple percent being depressed to 15 or 20% being depressed, that is a gigantic increase. That is a big change in the dynamics of any organization. Yeah. And those of your listeners who are running businesses or in any way involved in any other institutions beyond the university, the students who you're hiring now, the students who are coming out of college, are facing these problems. I just want to share with you one Amazon review. A reviewer on Amazon of the Coddling book wrote, "I couldn't understand why my new bright young workers kept running to HR for every little interpersonal problem and why they refused to show up to meetings with the person who they thought offended them. This book explains a lot about those recent bad hires." So I certainly don't want to, damn a whole generation. Most of the kids are doing fine. Most of them are going to be great employees. Yeah. But people who are hiring people born after 1995 are going to have to realize many of them will come into your organization with different expectations about how you as the boss will protect them. Yeah. And if there's a conflict, we have denied them the practice of thousands of opportunities to resolve those conflicts with no adult present. They will expect HR or the boss to mediate. And this is it's already causing a lot of problems for organizations. I'm hearing this from a lot of people in the business world.
I've heard, very much the same from the business side. And I think we've got that combination of those that are listening that are those that may be hiring from this generation, and a lot that are listening that are parents of this generation that are very concerned about some of the patterns that are coming up. I think it's interesting the way in which you've gone about presenting this, and what you're showing and what you're illustrating is that in our very desire to protect our kids, which is a very natural instinct, we've gone too far and we're actually harming our kids.
That's right. In fact, I want to share with you a way of thinking about this that I just thought of over the weekend, and I've been playing with it. So I'd like to just try it out here. Let's see how it sounds.
Go for it.
So there's a really interesting fact about human development, which is different from chimpanzee development. So chimpanzees, like other animals, when they're born, they're small, and then they grow and grow and grow as fast as they can until they reach reproductive age. Why wouldn't you grow as fast as you can? Humans are different. Humans grow just like chimpanzees until the age of 7 or 8, and then we slow down. And then we have a period from about 8 to 12 or 7 to 12, something like that, in which we don't grow very fast. And that's rather weird. Why would we delay puberty? By evolutionary thinking, that's very risky and expensive. Why wouldn't we get to reproductive age as quickly as possible? And there are several anthropologists who have speculated, and I think they're right, that this is a temporary period. It's a period for culture learning. And if you look all over the world, I've studied street kids. This is the age of street kids. So you can't have 5-year-olds out on the street alone, but you can have 8-year-olds out on the street alone. And all over the world, in poor cities around the world, you find 8, 9, 10-year-old kids. They can steal food. They can run from the police. They can find a place to sleep. They're actually out there looking for challenges. I'm not saying it's good to be a street kid. What I'm saying is there's a burst of competence, and then they practice skills. If you look at kids' stories, they're mostly about 8 to 12-year-old kids who go away from parental supervision and find their way. So this is when kids are developing cultural competence. They're learning all kinds of social skills. They're learning what the culture is like. All right. Now, what have we done to our kids during this time? If you ask, and I've done this, you ask in any room, you say, okay, people over 40, at what age were you allowed out of the house? At what age could you walk 6 blocks to a store with no adult with you? It's totally alone. You're outside on the street alone. Or you can walk, a half mile to a friend's house. At what age? People over 40, it's between 6 and 8. Nobody says 10. It's, 6, 7, 8 years old. That's the age that you get on your bicycle. You ride around town. you ask then, okay, they say now people under 25. And so I do this on college campuses, people under 25. And so it's all basically 11 to 14.
Yeah.
You almost never hear 10. One woman, I just gave a talk at Case Western. She said 6. And I looked at her and said, really 6? And she said, well, yeah, but that was in the Philippines. Then we moved here and it was 12. So think about this.
Interesting.
Think about this. Evolution has designed a learning program for Homo sapiens. Our species uniquely gives kids from age 8 to 12 to wander around, get in scrapes, learn how to be away from adults, but you can run back to your parent. You do have a safe base. So that's the evolutionary plan for our development. And what have we done? We messed it up. We said, no, let's not let kids use that period to learn independence. Let's keep them at home, give them devices, give them tutoring, shuttle them around to lesson after lesson after lesson, and make damn sure that they never get to make a decision for themselves. Then at around 13 or 14, when it's too late, then we'll let them out, but they don't want to go out. Now they just want to sit around and be on their devices socializing. And then they go off to college. And what happens? They're not ready to live independently. So I think it's a complete tragedy what we have done to kids who are born after 1995.
Well, number one, I'm glad you did try that out on the show, because I think that's a really interesting way to be able to take a look at this. There is this really interesting period of time where we're going through the assimilation to culture and learning and trying and challenging and scraping knees and all those types of things that are part of how we start to grow into that level of independence that really is not occurring, certainly not in the way that, and I really like the highlight of the way in which past generations, because that idea of what age were you allowed to leave the house, go out on your bike or otherwise, that is a very interesting way of looking at it, because it is a big dividing line between past generations and some of the earliest ones, newest ones. I think it's interesting then, because I'm looking at the untruths that are presented in this book, and I'm curious about this as well. There's 3 specific, for everybody listening, there's 3 specific untruths, the kind of myths that have been perpetuated by what's going on out there right now. One is around fragility, meaning that the belief that what doesn't kill you makes you weaker, so we need to really protect our children. There's the untruth of emotional reasoning, meaning the way in which we support and trust all of our feelings. The third is this idea of us versus them. The world has good people and bad people, and it's evil people, and it's a battle back and forth. And so what's interesting to me, and I guess I'm curious, John, in what you've seen, I think that it looks to me, this first one around fragility is the way that we as adults, because I'm going to turn this back to the adults right now, the way that we as adults have desired to protect our children in what we now perceive as an unsafe world. Mm-hmm. And then the aspects of emotional reasoning and us versus them, I'm curious how much is that perpetuating it to our kids, and how much is that our kids looking at us and saying, I'm learning it from you, I'm watching it.
Yeah, that's right. So the first one, especially the idea that what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. Obviously, most of your listeners will recognize that that's an inversion of Nietzsche's original formulation. What doesn't kill me makes me stronger, and that is about the principle of anti-fragility from Nassim Taleb. That there are many systems that if they are threatened or damaged, they will crack or break. So you have to protect them. Things like a wine glass is fragile. But there are others that require being challenged or even threatened. So Taleb was writing about the banking system, which collapsed in 2008. Mm-hmm. He called it. He predicted that because it was so fragile. And the immune system, which requires exposure to dirt and germs and in order to learn what to be responsive to. So in many ways, we've protected our kids and therefore prevented them from developing their anti-fragility, and in the process, we've made them fragile. Your specific question was about the third one, the us versus them. So my second book, The Righteous Mind, is really all about the psychology of tribalism. I trace it back to our evolution for religion. We evolved, I believe, to be religious creatures with small-scale religions worshiping rocks and trees and certain things that our group holds sacred, and then we circle around them, and then we're bound together as a group. This, I think, was our evolutionary heritage that gave us much of our social life and made politics possible. It made team sports possible. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it has a toxic side. It has a destructive side. Obviously, it can be scaled up into war, racism. And so if you're going to construct a diverse democracy, you need to keep the tribalism turned down. You don't want it to be up to the point where people think that violence is justified. Right. If you're trying to create a diverse university. You want to turn the tribalism down. You don't want people to be emphasizing group identity, race, religion, gender as dividing points. You want to encourage people to treat each other as individuals. So our evolution for tribal conflict is an interesting aspect of us, and we have to design our institutions in ways that minimize the harm caused by that tribalism. Mm-hmm. Our concern in the book is that much of what we do to socialize students when they arrive on campus is a form of identity politics that emphasizes these differences and that moralizes them. It's not just that there are differences, it's that there are some groups that are good and some that are bad. And I think we really should not be teaching students to think that way.
So I want to get a little bit further into that idea of how we turn up and turn down some of the tribalism. I want to get into that in a moment. Just before we do, because I think it's part of what allows us to do some of this as well, is also that continued conversation on emotional reasoning. And so part of emotional reasoning, first and foremost, is one of those cognitive distortions that you present in the book, comes out of some of the cognitive behavioral therapy work. It's one of the ways that we, try to not just trust, but justify the feelings that we have and explain them in a certain way to say that, no, this is completely right and this is where we are. And so what struck me, and I guess maybe even in tying this even to fragility, was that a big part of what you're talking about, and I love that metaphor of the immune system, because it's almost like we're looking to build our emotional immune system, right, so that we have that strength to encounter situations that are maybe incredibly uncomfortable to us, let alone a mental immune system where we're not threatened by every idea that just doesn't happen to fit into our ideology.
Mm-hmm. That's right. So thinking about the immune system in the age of the internet, I think is very, very useful. Yeah. And so here's an example. So the big picture here is that our kids are safer than ever physically. The crime wave is over. Diseases have been conquered. There's very little violence. Obviously, there are highly publicized cases of police violence. I'm not saying everything is fine, but if you look at the statistics, crime and violence are way down. Yeah. But at the same time, the internet is all pervasive, and it's impossible to live your life without coming across offensive things written on the internet, racist, sexist, homophobic. You're going to find those things. So the question is, how should we raise our kids in such a world where they're physically safe, but they're going to be exposed to lots of offensive words? Well, you might think, because they're so physically safe, we should let them out and let them explore the world, because they're not going to get physically hurt as much as they would when I was growing up. I was born in the 60s, and there was a lot of crime in the 60s and 70s. But at the same time, you want them to be immune, or at least not react with an autoimmune response, or not an autoimmune, with immune response. If they see bad words, they're going to see bad words. And so I'm reminded of how when I was a kid, if you go into any public bathroom, that isn't kept perfectly clean and painted, there'd be graffiti. And among the graffiti would always be an image of a penis and a vagina and a swastika. And there was just a variety of stuff, and the F word. Kids would write stuff. They'd scratch it in the paint with a key. And I'm Jewish, and so I grew up, there would be swastikas in the bathroom. And then somebody would often cross it out, like you turn a swastika into a box. So that's a perfect good response. If there's a swastika, turn it into a box. But, now, I get anti-Semitic emails now and then from strangers, or people will say things on my page. And it's not pleasant, but it's not that unpleasant. It's like, I think, a jerk or asshole, and that's it. It doesn't damage my day at all. And I think it's in part because I was exposed to that as a kid. Now, if someone is calling my home and leaving threatening messages on my answers, that's very different. Yeah. But you have to raise kids so that they don't react to the stuff that we know they're going to see that doesn't actually have any implications for their life or their success. Yeah. So I think we're going about this all wrong. Now, if a swastika were to appear, scratched in a tiny little swastika, scratched into the bathroom stall anywhere at Yale University, the campus would go on lockdown. There would be yet more mandatory diversity training. I mean, it would be a catastrophe. Why would an institution set itself up for that? No institution can ever reach zero. No institution can ever go a year without a single person saying or doing something that someone else finds racially or religiously or in any other way offensive. You can't get to zero. And so to set yourself up so that zero is the only acceptable standard it just guarantees our institutions are going to be torn, divided, angry forever.
Yeah. how do we bolster that emotional resiliency? I mean, one of the you propose some really wonderful ways forward in it, both for us individually as well as for things we can do in the education system and society. And one of those things you talk about individually is how we prepare the child for the road, not the road for the child. Love that phrase, by the way.
Yeah, that's right.
But how do we support children, both in parenting and education, to build that emotional resiliency so things are not perceived as threats, especially those things we know are going to happen?
Yeah, that's right. Well, the first is we've got to discourage the language of safety for things that are not about physical safety. So this is one of the most repugnant trends to my mind, is the concept of emotional safety. Yeah. What it means is something is emotionally upsetting. It's put in terms of safety. So my daughter, my kids go to New York City public schools. And on the playground, they're heavily monitored. There are adults watching. There can be no conflicts, no fighting, often no running. Someone might get hurt. And so one event was the kids in third grade, the kids would form clubs. That is, my daughter and two of her friends, they called themselves the Kitty Cat Club or something like that. And, different groups would form their clubs, and then they'd say, you can't come in, this is the Kitty Cat Club. And so, of course, this was a big concern for the teacher. The teacher doesn't want anyone to exclude anyone. Now, I think it's essential that kids learn how to deal with exclusion. But all right, it's a very good opportunity for a discussion by the teacher. Yeah. She could lead that. Let's talk about inclusion. But the email that she sent out, including to the parents, the email that she sent out was about how we want all kids to feel safe. Yeah. Really? Yeah. Really? This is a matter of danger and safety? I don't want my daughter thinking that way. If my daughter is excluded from something, she can be annoyed. She could be hurt. But I don't want her to feel that she's in danger and therefore has to get an adult to help her. This is a terrible thing to do to kids. Mm-hmm.
That's it's a really interesting thing to propose that or to note that we're turning these situations into something that is perceived as dangerous. Mm-hmm. Right. It's really, really interesting as to, and it seems like so many of these situations, and again, out of exactly as you note in the book, out of good intention, out of the idea that we do want to care for our children, but it seems like a lot of these issues are being pushed to their extreme. And I think that's one of the interesting threads through the book. And again, it's not specifically presented this way, but there is a balance. There's a middle way or a moderation that you're proposing through so much of this
that's right.
Should be common sense, but we know that common sense isn't always common sense, and including for the smartest among us. We don't always follow what we know.
Hey, in a sense, when you put it that way, it just suddenly occurs to me that what we are doing is actually an example of emotional reasoning. What I mean by that is that there are three basic psychological principles that the book is about. And I've already mentioned them. We're anti-fragile, we're prone to emotional reasoning, and we're prone to tribalism. Yeah. Okay, those are very simple ideas. And in the book, we show how, so the subtitle of the book is really what the book is about, how good intentions and bad ideas are setting up a generation for failure. Yeah. Now, if we know the three psychological ideas, we could easily design child-rearing practices and strategies that would bring out the best in kids, that would strengthen them and make them strong and independent. But, if you see your kid is being teased, it's painful, and you want to do something about it. Now, bullying that goes on more than one day, I totally agree. That needs to stop. But in our zeal for anti-bullying policies, we've gotten the idea that if a kid is insulted, teased, excluded, that he's being bullied. My kids talk this way sometimes, that this is the way kids learn to talk. And of course, I don't want, my son was not exact. Well, he calls it bullying. It kind of was borderline. It went on for several days, and the teacher did step in and handle it very gracefully. So, I think that was right because it went on several days. But I would never want the teacher coming in if one kid is just being mean. Kids say mean things. I would not want my kids to be protected from mean things. So it's. But we go with our feelings, and our feelings are compassion, protection for our kids, and we therefore end up overprotecting them and once again denying them the broad range of experiences, including negative experiences, that they must have to become independent adults.
So again, for everybody listening, I just want to go back to, part of the beginning of this conversation. Exactly, John, what you just described. It's when the elephant takes over and we're going along for the ride. And so for us to be, aware in the moment of when we start to feel the emotions start to rise and the protection instinct or any of these types of things kick in, is to try to remember at that moment, wait a minute, where's the elephant going to take me? Where's the rider in this conversation? What's really best? What am I really trying to accomplish here? What's going to be the best thing to do at this moment overall, not just for the temporary?
That's right. And so a dictum that my mother learned from a very wise child psychologist in the 1960s, Haidt was his name. My mother learned, she took parenting courses when my sisters and I were very young, and she was overwhelmed and didn't know what to do with us. And one of the dictums that she learned is, don't just do something, stand there.
Yes.
Because we tend to be over-involved. And my wife and I do this. I certainly do it. Our kids are fighting. Our tendency is to jump in, play judge, say, no, you shouldn't say this. No, this time it was your fault. And when we do that, we deprive them of the ability to work it out. Now, especially when the kids have an age difference. My son is 3 years older than my daughter. He's physically stronger. Sometimes you do have to do something. I'm not saying just always stand back and never do anything. But these days, American parents tend to be overprotective, over-intrusive. We have to learn to step back and see it as strengthening our kids.
Well, I appreciate you bringing that up, because I think it's, number one, I happen to love that specific dictum, that quote of don't just do something, stand there. And I think and I think it's so clear in a lot of what you're presenting in the book, is that there's the phrase of don't just do something, stand there. And then there's the don't just stand there, do something. And I think what you're describing is the wisdom to know the difference.
Well, that's right. But I would say those principles they look radically different to a parent who truly has the long-term interest of the kid in mind, and to an administrator, teacher, or principal who's worried about lawsuits.
Yes.
And so anybody who is worried about lawsuits in our insanely litigious culture, for them, the dictum is, don't just stand there, do something. Because if you do something, you can say you were responding to the problem. But if you stand there, you can be sued. And so this is part of the difficulty.
So let me ask you about that, because I didn't want to leave the conversation without coming back to that tribal side, because there's the reason why I want to go to talk about the tribal is also what you just brought up, which is that there's stuff we can do individually, and then there's stuff systemically that we just need to take a look at. And so if we begin just first on the tribal side, one of the things that you brought out was this difference between common humanity versus common enemy identity politics. And I was wondering if you just share a little bit about that, because it makes use of things that are part of who we are. We do have a tribalistic nature to who we are, but there's ways of doing it that build the whole and build us as a healthier society versus just tearing us apart.
Well, that's right. So in analyzing events on campus, you wade right into the middle of the culture war. So it's not that students are turning against free speech per se. A lot of the central issues are around diversity and inclusion. And if any book or speaker is seen as incompatible with goals of diversity and inclusion, that's what tends to get shouted down or excluded. So the left then says, oh, well, free speech is just wanted by racists and Nazis. And the right says these snowflake fascists they can't stand, they're weaklings and snowflakes, all that. So if you comment on this, you're almost always taking a side in the culture war. And Greg and I we're both, we're, if anything, on the left. I'm a centrist, but neither of us have ever voted for Republican. We're very concerned about what's going on in the country politically. I don't want to comment too much on current politics, but suffice it to say that neither of us are on the right in any way, shape, or form. But we are concerned about the fact that the elite universities especially are overwhelmingly on one side politically, and that leads to a certain orthodoxy, a certain pressure on speech. Now, what we did in the book is we had to dive into this. We had to understand what's going on. What we realized is that identity politics is necessary. It's not a bad thing necessarily. On the right, they're always railing about, identity politics is going to destroy the country. And what we realized is there are ways of advocating for if one group, be it African Americans or trans students, or if any group is being denied equal dignity or equal access, this is a justice problem. This is a problem. And if you try to address it, well, that is a form of identity politics. And what we say in the book is that historically, there have been two ways of approaching this. You can either say, let's appeal to everyone's common memberships and humanity. Let's say, look, we're all Yale students here. Let's try to work it out. Or we're all Americans, or we're all Christians, or whatever it is. And if you look at the language of Martin Luther King and many of the civil rights leaders, they relentlessly appealed to the humanity of their brothers and sisters. They spoke in a Christian language of brothers and sisters. They spoke in an American language of the founding documents, issuing a promise, a promissory note. And so that's the way, if you say, look, we're all in this together, we all share something. Now, please listen to us. Something is wrong. We need to fix it. That ends up working. The other way of doing it, we call common enemy identity politics. And this has really exploded on campus. There are ideas known as intersectionality, where you analyze everybody in terms of about 7 or 10 different dimensions, binary dimensions. So male, female, white, black, gay, straight. And on each one end of the dimension is bad, is the powerful, oppressive side. They're bad. And so you add up the bad points or you add up the good points, and you know a person's moral worth. Well, this is madness. This is complete madness to do. I mean, it's one thing if you're trying to want to rally people for war and get them to hate the other side, but if you're trying to create an environment that is inclusive, cooperative, in which people learn from each other, it's complete madness to activate the tribal sentiments and the moral resentment and anger against some members of the community. So that's what we're arguing against, is this common enemy. So I'll just quote one of the best quotes we have in the book from Pauli Murray, was an African-American civil rights activist very early on. She was gay or trans, complicated sexuality. And she wrote, "I intend to destroy segregation by positive and embracing methods. When my brothers try to draw a circle to exclude me, I shall draw a larger circle to include them. Where they speak out for the privileges of a puny group, I shall shout for the rights of all mankind." So that's the way we do it. That's the way to do it, we think.
Yeah. I think that's one of the just one of those very powerful type of images of draw the circle to include. And I think that's one of the things that's really interesting in that idea of the common humanity that is out there, is to look at the ways in which, and you look at the division, the polarization that's going on. Certainly politics is the quintessential of what's going on right now. And that idea of how is it that we can begin to reach across the proverbial aisle? How is it that we can reach to other segments of the people that live here in this nation who do not think the way that I think? And how is it that I can include them in the circle and get to know, understand what's sacred to them, what their values are, where do they come from? Because it's only through that level of understanding that we're going to start to have a very different conversation in this country.
That's right. And that's what, so I'm not saying that everybody has to love everybody.
No.
I think Donald Trump has done some horrific things. I'm not saying people have to include him in the circle. But I think in a democracy, we have to look at the people who voted for the other side are still human beings. They're not just human beings, they're still our fellow citizens. My wife did a wonderful project. If you go to she'swithhim.com, she's a photographer, and she took photographs of women who voted for Trump who are from demographics that you wouldn't expect.
Right.
And I think this is one of the challenges for the left in the wake of the Trump election, is to not demonize everyone who voted for Trump. You can certainly say he's wrong. Look, if you want to demonize him, I'm not going to say there should be no demonization in politics, but we have to realize that, hundreds of millions, tens of millions of our fellow citizens can't be demons.
Well, and I think even looking at that, one of the other issues that you raised in the book is this idea of understanding intent versus impact. And much of the judgments that are being made right now, and use that example of those that voted for Trump that may not be understood by the other side of the aisle, what we're talking about is judging people based off of the result of what occurred, as opposed to trying to understand what was the intention, what was going on, where were they coming from, what was the understanding, which all of a sudden, again, leads to a very different conversation.
That's right. And that's the idea of microaggressions. The idea that if someone says something, if someone tells a joke or uses a word, and very often microaggressions are about a single word. So if someone uses a word that someone else takes offense to, it's not that they dislike the word, it's that the word is an act of aggression. Now, again, this is very foolish. If you're creating a diverse community, the more diversity you have, the more misunderstandings there will be. And if you try to educate students to make to say fewer offensive things, that's great, that's important. But if at the same time that you're improving behavior, you're making people more polite, if at the same time you're lowering the bar and telling students to be more and more offended by smaller and smaller things, then at best you stay in place. At worst, things are getting objectively better. People are more sensitive. Yet at the same time, members of historically marginalized groups feel more and more excluded and marginalized and aggressed against. So I think, again, these policies that we implement towards the goal of diversity and inclusion sometimes backfire and hurt the very people we're trying to help.
So I guess because there's several things that we talked about that give everybody listening an understanding of maybe a few of the things to begin on individually. And there's a lot more in the book of individually what to consider. What is one of those things at more of that systemic type level? Because we've got that which we can do for us personally. But I also know that if we only focus on the personal, it's going to take a while to change course, as it were.
That's right.
How do we get involved in that bigger scene as well?
Well, so there's two things. One, you have to think about child rearing as a system and then university as a system. So child rearing as a system is not just about what I do with my kids. It's about the environment that my kids are growing up in. So it's hard for me to I can't send my kids out to play because there are no other kids out there. Nobody is out without an adult. So I recommend everybody who has kids go to letgrow.org.
Yeah.
It's an organization started by Lenore Skenazy, who wrote the book Free Range Kids. And she'll help you find kids in your neighborhood or families in your neighborhood that also believe in free range parenting. If you can designate a park or someplace where kids can meet up, they can begin to have those experiences that are so important to have between age 8 and 12, for example. So we have to work together with families and parents and schools to give our kids more freedom. It's hard you can do some things on your own, but it's much easier if you have a community that supports it.
Most definitely.
At the university level, leadership is essential, and there's not been much leadership. So university presidents and provosts and leaders should do what they can to endorse the Chicago Principles on Free Expression, which says that the university provides a platform for different members to contest. It does not take sides. It does not shut people down. It does not it does not get involved in the content of the debates. You have to have leadership to say that at orientation, of course, we value diversity and inclusion. We have a lot of programming for students on diversity and inclusion, but related to that is also free speech, free inquiry. What are we doing here? Why are we together? And a certain amount of friction and argument is unavoidable. Not just unavoidable, it's actually necessary. So at universities, leaders must set norms. And they must set norms that will allow the university to be effective in its task, its telos or purpose of discovering truth. So again, leadership, norm setting, policies that support free inquiry, orientation that trains students. So here's one of my best recommendations for you. So I'm part of a small organization. We created a program called Open Mind. If you go to openmindplatform.org, we have a program that walks people through why viewpoint diversity is good, why it's so hard for us to accept others, how you can actually talk to people who differ from you. And it's being tested in hundreds of classrooms. It's doing great. People love it. So if you are involved in any organization, it could be a church, it could be a corporation, it could be a school class, any place where people are beginning to come apart politically and argue and find the mere existence of other people difficult. So I co-founded an organization called heterodoxacademy.org, and it's a group of 2,300 professors right now who believe that we should have more viewpoint diversity and that it's good to talk to people who differ from you. So listeners can go to heterodoxacademy.org. We have a lot of resources there. We have a wonderful book we created from John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, just the second chapter. It's beautifully illustrated. It's free on the website. Great if you're interested in free speech or arguments for why our diversity of viewpoints is good. Let's see. So those are some of my main recommendations. There's a lot that we know about social interaction and how groups can go wrong, how we can descend into polarization spirals, and how we can escape. The goal of much of my work in moral psychology is to help us understand we evolved as tribal creatures prepared for war, but we're also really good at trade, at burying the hatchet, at seeking out diversity, and at learning from each other. And so I'm hopeful that our universities, our schools, our corporations, our religious institutions will weather this storm, this crisis, this tornado of polarization and hatred that we're going through now as a country. And I hope we'll learn how to get along better with each other. It's not going to happen on its own. We have to take steps. to create norms and an environment in which we understand that good people can disagree.
Jonathan, I think we very much share that idea, that mission, that vision of starting to play to that side of ourselves. And I want to thank you so much for being here on One Idea Away to share this work and to share that message.
My pleasure, Luke. Great to talk to you.
You know, for everybody listening, again, this is just to be really clear. This is not a call for us to be safer, to overprotect, or to even dial down the rhetoric. Instead, it's just a time for us to dial up the understanding, the curiosity, the patience, the awareness, the non-reactivity and empathy and common ground, so that people can speak more freely and we can begin to understand each other more clearly. We have an opportunity in front of us. The difficult divides that we face are now in full light, and that gives us a time to create a brand new possibility. I hope you're going to join us on that road. So with that, as always, I want to thank you for tuning in and continue to enjoy the journey. Hey, as this episode is wrapping up, you may be asking yourself, what's next? Well, what's next? I hope that you've been joining in on the monthly live cast that we do for the One Idea Away community. You see, every single month, we gather some incredible guests that are talking about the types of transitions that they've made or are even in the midst of making to create a happier life, to create a life that's more aligned to who they truly are. So we're talking about happiness and purpose. We're talking about community. We're talking about how do we have that modern day success, meaning how do we succeed in our happiness, our well-being, our quality of life, while also making a great living, making the difference in the contributions that we are each meant to make. So when you get involved in the monthly live cast, you can ask some questions of our guests. You can participate with some of the other community members and the ongoing chat that just seems to explode as we get into these deeper conversations throughout the whole hour that we do this. So the only way, though, that you can get these special episodes is when you register for them. It is free, but you got to register to get involved and continue the conversation as we're always talking about. So just hop on over to oneideaaway.com/livecast and to oneideaaway.com/livecast. Join us there, get involved in the conversation, get involved in the community. I can't wait to continue the conversation with you. Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you really enjoyed it, do me a favor, let us know. You can keep the conversation going and send us a message on our Facebook page, which is simply One Idea Away. Go ahead and tag me in the post or even just direct messages. Also, I would be incredibly grateful if you could share this episode along with someone that you believe could benefit from hearing the ideas and the messages that we got into. That's pretty much why we do this. So you can just go ahead and share it from your app or email it along, whatever works for you. The point is to share, to talk, to discuss, and keep the dialogue going, because it's in those conversations that ideas can take hold and create profound shifts in perspective. That's what allows us to live life more fully, deeply, and consciously. As always, we would love to see you post a review for the podcast in iTunes or whichever app you're using. And until next time, remember, you're never more than one idea away from a whole new reality. This is Luke Iorio and One Idea Away, signing off.